What in our food supply is making us sick? What can we do about it? Find out how we can improve our family's health with essential knowledge and smarter food choices. And on our green tips, community gardening. Next on Living Smart. She's the mother of four, a former MBA and investment advisor. But in her most recent career as an author and activist, she forges a new path. Her latest book is The Unhealthy Truth, How Our Food is Making Us Sick and What We Can Do About It. She warns consumers about the poison found in everyday meals and the ugly truths of the food industry and FDA, which may not have the consumer's health as a priority when making their products. O'Brien is the founder of Allergy Kids to help parents whose children suffer from food allergies. Today we'll find out what we can do about it all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I know that you had a transformation within you when you decided to write this book. Tell me what happened.
Well, as I share, I am a very, very unlikely crusader for cleaning up the food supply. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. We had our 3 square meals a day, but we also had our fair share of po' boys and Twinkies. And after, having been born and raised in Houston, I went on to get an MBA and I served as an analyst on Wall Street. And, with all of the incredible drive and ambition that I'd always had channeled in me, we threw that into motherhood and fatherhood, and we had 4 children. And prior to that, I really hadn't paid much attention to the food supply. I figured if it was on grocery store shelves, it was safe. And I had 4 little kids, picky eaters, limited time, limited budget, and I really didn't think much about it. And then one morning over breakfast, my youngest child had an allergic reaction. And it began this remarkable journey. And in that, I suddenly began to unearth research. There were things that I was learning that I couldn't unlearn. And there was a tremendous responsibility that I felt to convey what I had learned. And that morning, when she had that allergic reaction, I learned that from 1997 till 2002, there had been a doubling of the peanut allergy. And that 1 out of 17 children under the age of 3 now had a food allergy. And that according to the Centers for Disease Control, there had been a 265% increase in the rate of hospitalizations related to food allergic reactions. And these are just jaw-dropping statistics. I hadn't really known anybody that had food allergies when I was a kid. And up until that point, I had a couple of kids that ate PB&J, and I really didn't want someone telling me what to feed my kids.
Right.
Yet the finance wonk in me, was looking at these statistics thinking, what is going on? And with that, I was researching what exactly is a food allergy. And a food allergy is when your body sees food as foreign, and it launches an inflammatory response to drive out this perceived foreign invader. And so, that can come across as, an allergic reaction with watery eyes or itchy skin or mucousy, or in some cases it can be life-threatening. And so with that, I stopped and I said, is there something foreign in our food that wasn't there when we were children that could account for this increase? And that's when I was absolutely shocked to learn that in 1994, we began to engineer foreign proteins into our food supply to enhance profitability for the food industry. And so the analyst in me had profound appreciation for that profit-driven incentive. Yet at the same time, governments around the world said, these proteins, these foreign proteins, have not yet been proven safe. And therefore, we don't want to allow them into our food supply because they have not yet been proven safe. However, here in the U.S., we have a different approach. We say it hasn't yet been proven dangerous, and we'll allow it into the food supply until that might happen. And so beginning in 1994, beginning in the dairy industry, we introduced a synthetic protein into our dairy, into our milk. And it was designed to increase the lactating profitability of the cows. The governments around the world said, this is showing to make the cows sick. It requires increased antibiotic use in these animals. It is fully disclosed on the packaging and on the labeling that it causes ovarian cysts, mastitis, all of these conditions in the animals. And because of that alone, these governments said, we don't want that into our food supply. We don't want to present this potential risk to our eaters. Studies continued to come out that showed that this same protein elevated hormone levels that were linked to breast, prostate, and colon cancer. And with that, again, being an analyst with this research background, I wanted to see what the statistics said. And I went to the American Cancer Society, and I learned that the U.S. has the highest rate of cancer of any country in the world. And that migration studies show that if you were to move here from somewhere like Japan, your likelihood of developing cancer increases fourfold. And those were just stunning statistics. And at that point, as a mother, I thought, how many sippy cups of this milk have I filled? And how many bowls of cereal have I poured this into, not knowing that this growth hormone, this synthetic protein, has not been allowed in Canada, the UK, all across Europe, Japan, and Australia. And as I stepped back and learned that according to CNN, milk is the most common allergy in the United States,
it is.
I went to the allergist and I said, is my child with a milk allergy allergic to the milk we all grew up drinking? Or is he allergic to this synthetic protein that was introduced in 1994? And they said, we don't know. No tests have ever been developed to test for that. And so then, I turned to the list of the top allergens. Milk, dairy is, the leading allergen, soy, yes. Some of the others, and I turned to soy. And I thought, are we allergic to soy that we've consumed for generations, or is there something new in soy? And I was stunned to learn that a few years after the introduction of the synthetic protein in milk in 1994, soy was engineered, because soy is primarily used to fatten livestock and drive profitability in the livestock industry. And what was happening is that the animals weren't getting fat fast enough. And so soy was engineered to be a high-sugar soybean so that it could fatten the livestock quickly. And again, governments around the world said, we don't know what this will do to the rates of obesity. We don't know what this might do with diabetes. We simply don't know. And therefore, we will not introduce this into the food supply. And yet, here in the U.S., again, we took the standard that it hasn't yet been proven dangerous. We'll allow it in. And we allowed that into the U.S. food supply. And interestingly, according to publications like The Economist, diabetes is often referred to as an American epidemic. And so as I continued to unearth this, there were stunning revelations, and having not grown up as a foodie, I was absolutely just stunned to learn these things. And yet at the same time, I couldn't unlearn them. And as I began to learn about the incentives and the profit-driven intentions of these corporations, as an analyst, I had respect for that, because that had been my career prior to motherhood. Yet the conflict as a mother was tremendous, and to realize that a different value had been placed on the lives of not only children around the world, but of citizens around the world. And a much more precautionary principle had been engaged in order to protect the health of their citizens. And so as tremendously horrifying as some of that information was to unearth, it also brought me to a point where I realized there was so much that I could do to protect the health of my family. And so with that, I simply began to try to feed my kids the way children around the world are fed, and reduce their exposure to some of these chemicals and some of these foreign proteins.
Now, we'll talk about when you decide to write the book. Obviously, you're doing all this research, or your background in research helped with all of this. But tell me about the meeting that you had with Random House. It's not easy to get your book published for the first time out. You're not an author. You are now an author. But at the time, you were an unknown. And you sat down with a bunch of powerful women in New York to convince them to do this book. Tell me what happened in that meeting.
Well, it was interesting, because as I was unearthing the information, I realized that, food's an incredibly intimate issue. It's got emotional triggers, physical, on many levels. And that there were going to be plenty of people who didn't want to hear what I have to say, who were going to dismiss it as a theory that they just simply weren't comfortable with. And so with that, I began to reach out. I did tremendous research, and I reached out to people that I knew were already very well versed in this space, who understood the potential risks of these synthetic proteins, who had been advocating about conservative stances on the introduction of these things into the food supply since they began in 1994. And so as I share, I kind of had to find my choir. And so I reached out to like-minded people, like-minded researchers, like-minded scientists. I really, I did a tremendous amount of research on these individuals. And as I share in the story, when I reached out to people like Aaron Brockovich and these other remarkable crusaders, I would do research for weeks before crafting a 4-sentence email so that it presented as a balanced, credible, analysis. And as I began to engage these different people, with just such great humility. They were scientists that had served in administrations. They were people like Aaron Brockovich, Nell Newman, the founder of Newman's Own Organic. People started to pay attention because truly there really was nothing special about me. It was just simply I had found my heart's work, and I couldn't silence that. And as I began to engage these people, people started to take notice. And so, I appeared on the CBS Early Show. And I appeared in the New York Times, and it was in that, without anything special. It was simply my love of my children and my research and my laptop. I was then approached actually by the publishing industry, and they came to me. And so with that, I'd had just piles of research and, a blog and a newsletter. And the thought of trying to harness all of that and pull it together into a book was pretty overwhelming and tremendous. And I did find myself in New York, in a handful of different meetings with these top publishers. And what was so amazing is that as I shared the story, they all realized, we're all at this table together.
It's children.
It's not just the children. We're all eating. And as I began to share the research that 1 in 3 kids now has autism, allergies, ADHD, or asthma, and we all know the statistics that at least 1 in 8 women has breast cancer, what I did share is that only 1 out of 10 of those breast cancer cases are genetic, which means 9 out of 10 of them are environmentally triggered. And with that, it's information that you can then use to do something to protect the health of your family.
Shocking. Was everything shocking? What was the most shocking thing you found as you were doing all this research?
For me, I think probably the most difficult thing was having to address a system that I had held to believe in, that was protecting the interest of my family, the interest of the consumers. And yet at the same time, having served, some time on Wall Street as an analyst, I did recognize that the corporations are treated, as a citizen in a lot of cases in this country too. And so, as I really was addressing the toxicity of the food supply, I really had to also address some long-held beliefs, and that was incredibly difficult at times. It was, a loss I really had to grieve and to really take responsibility for.
There are 3 substances that you mention in your book that are banned in Europe and other countries and not in the United States. High fructose corn syrup, aspartame, and food colorings. Tell me about those 3 things and why they're bad for us.
Well, as a mother of 4 with 2 little boys, one of the things that I share and that I did unearth is that yellow number 5 is not used in children's products in other developed countries because of its link to hyperactivity in kids.
Yellow number 5 is what? Is it food coloring?
It's a food coloring.
Okay.
It's a bright yellow. It's used in mac and cheese. It's used in pickles. It's used in mustard.
Okay.
And because of its link to hyperactivity, it's not used by Kraft and Coca-Cola and Walmart in the products that they formulate for eaters overseas.
Overseas. It's okay to do it here, but it's not okay to do it over there.
Overseas. And their response is because consumers are aware overseas. So they've moved voluntarily ahead of legislation. It's not that they have to do it. They've moved voluntarily to meet consumer demand overseas. And so as I unearth these studies, there's a tremendous study out of Australia that I talk about in the book. It was so overwhelming, the conclusiveness of the results, that the food industry basically overseas moved voluntarily to remove these ingredients. And so as a mother, I thought, well, I'm going to try to get yellow number 5 out of my kids' diet. And with that, I really began to think, along the lines of this grandmother theory. Would my grandmother have had a jar of yellow number 5 on her kitchen counter when she was cooking?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
So let me try to get it out of my kids' diet, especially given the conclusiveness of these studies. And so with that, they were hooked on fluorescent mac and cheese. And we decided that we'd go to 3/4 of that fluorescent orange powder. And then we weaned them down to half the pack of powder, and then to 1/4 of the pack of powder, until they finally were used to the fact that noodles were the color of noodles. And as a mother, I took that same approach that you take to weaning a kid from a sippy cup or potty training them. This isn't going to happen overnight. And that, we all use food for different reasons, not just to feed ourselves. And so with that, we kicked out yellow number 5. Aspartame is another one. Aspartame is a synthetic chemical sweetener that's not used by Kraft and Coca-Cola and Walmart in the UK. And it's particularly not allowed to be used in children's products overseas because of its link to different types of cancers, concern about link to cancer, concern about weight gain. And so, again, our corporations have done an amazing job responding to the needs of consumers overseas and removing that ingredient. Aspartame, is a chemical sweetener here in the United States. As I went to the research, I learned that it's the most controversial food additive ever introduced into the U.S. food supply. It was introduced in 1981. And it's had more complaints than any other at the FDA. And so again, with that, I thought, how do I try to reduce my exposure to aspartame? And, in all candor, I had grown up on Diet Dr. Peppers and Diet Cokes. I'd gone through college on that. And so, again, it was really, it was a tremendous conflict. And then at the same time, I couldn't unlearn the information. And so, another one is high fructose corn syrup.
Which is in everything that people don't realize.
It's in everything. I mean, it's used as a preservative to hold things together on grocery store shelves. And it's engineered in a lab. And it's a tremendous process, actually, the engineering of high fructose corn syrup. And so on two fronts, because of the chemical engineering of the product itself, but also, as I learned, in the late 1990s, in order to drive profitability for the corn industry, there had been growing concern of the spraying of insecticides over cornfields. And so scientists were able to engineer that insecticidal protein into the DNA of a corn seed so that as the plant grows, it releases its own insecticide. And again, governments around the world said this has never been proven safe. The few studies that we do have show toxicity and organ damage. And so not only do we not want this fed to our citizens, but in some countries they didn't want it fed to their livestock. And in some countries like France and in New Zealand, they were not even going to allow it planted in their soil. And because there is no labeling of that corn here in the United States, there's no way to know if it's blended into high fructose corn syrup. And so again, governments around the world said, we just don't want that ingredient in our food supply.
Genetically modified foods, that's the trend now. What's so bad about that, or what's so good about it?
I think there's a lot of controversy around genetic engineering, and again, that's basically you're manipulating the DNA of agriculture to engineer these traits and these technologies into something, for example, the corn, so that it can grow its own insecticide. And in doing that, you're introducing a new technology. Some people call it, I like to refer to it as techno-food. When you introduce that technology, it's yours, you own it, and you can patent it. And so, corn has been patented by these corporations. Soy has been patented. The protein we talked about in milk, it's patented. And so, there's ownership then of those agricultural commodities. And so, therefore, farmers then have to go back and purchase these seeds year after year after year, which goes against traditional farming, standard, which is you save your seeds, you grow them again the next year. But because they don't own that patent, they're not allowed to do that. They're actually in violation of a contract. And so, there's controversy around that piece of it. There's controversy around the genetic engineering process itself, because here in the U.S. they'll say, we've done the analysis, the proteins are the same. What they're not testing for are the new proteins that are created in that process. And when you're using gene guns and lasers to manipulate the DNA, it's really the unforeseen consequences that are of concern to countries around the world, which is why they have either prohibited the use or the introduction of these products, or if they are introduced, they insist on labeling so that consumers can make an informed choice. And so, as a mother of children with allergies, the new allergens that are created in the process, there are so many of them, they don't even have names. And so, again, to really step back and say, perhaps, maybe one of the first steps that we could take would be to introduce this under the Allergen Labeling Act, because simply these are just novel allergens. We don't know what the consequences will be.
Let's talk about what people can do. What are some of the steps? I know you changed the diet of your children. How hard was that?
It wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. But I think probably one of the greatest challenges was believing in my ability to actually do it. Because at that point, I didn't really trust that I could do more than hit 200 start on that microwave. And so, like I mentioned earlier, as we began to wean the children from the mac and cheese, the fluorescent mac and cheese, we took it in baby steps. And it was really important for me to not make the perfect the enemy of the good. We live in a real world where they go to these birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese and they're going to maybe get a blue cupcake, and there's only so much that you can control. Right. And so with that, we decided to strive for an 80-20 rule, where I tried to do a good job 80% of the time, and 20% of the time I just gave myself a pass, because, these are real kids, they're picky eaters, they're at birthday parties, you can't control everything. And so, as I learned about the impact that these synthetic colors had on children and hyperactivity, as a mother of 4, that was one of the first steps that I took, was how can I reduce my kids' exposure to some of these synthetic colors that are derived from petroleum. They're linked to hyperactivity. It just makes sense to try to get this out of the diet. And at that point, we were serving up some blue yogurt for breakfast. And so one of the first steps we took was we went to white yogurt and we put sprinkles on top. And the kids, they were like, it's white. Well, yeah, it's white, and we're going to put sprinkles on top, And so, again, it was, we just tried to reduce the exposure to some of the chemical colorants in the food supply. And that was a pretty easy first step. We were able to go from the multicolored goldfish to the single-colored goldfish till eventually we got to the pretzeled goldfish, where we were really trying to reduce their overall exposure to the chemicals. And so that was one of the first steps. One of the second steps was, upon learning about that synthetic growth hormone in the milk that, elevated hormone levels associated with cancer. That scared me pretty badly. And so I went to the grocery store, and it was so inspiring to learn that Walmart and Safeway, Kroger, Publix, across the country, those stores carry milk and dairy that is RBGH free. And it, didn't require that I change grocery stores. It wasn't some radical shift. It was in our budget. And so with that, we went to RBGH-free milk.
RBGH-free, what does it stand for, RBGH?
RBGH, recombinant bovine growth hormone. They recombine,
so they're free of that.
They recombine a bovine growth hormone, and then they inject it into the cows. And
free of that?
Yeah, so we were free of that.
And you noticed a difference in when they were started to drink milk? That kind of milk, you notice a difference?
Absolutely, and I think, the hyperactivity one is an incredibly rewarding first step, because you can see, we've had amazing feedback from readers, from mothers, through the websites, where people have said, wow, this happened immediately. A lot of the doctors will say, oh, this is just, circumstantial, anecdotal, this is hearsay. What I do urge parents to do is to step back and try to figure out where the doctor's funding is coming from. Because as I share in the book, a lot of these doctors serve on the speakers bureaus of certain drug companies. Their income in a lot of cases is derived from selling these drugs. And so, if they're saying this is anecdotal evidence, that's fine. Those are the same doctors that are probably telling us that a bowl of sugared cereal isn't going to make your kids hyper. And any mom knows, the impact that certain ingredients can have on their children. And so, again, these are just simple, smart steps that any family can take to reduce their exposure.
You also found some links between the FDA, the regulatory agencies are supposed to, regulate these industries, and they're not doing so.
That, again, was one of those things where I really, it did make me sad to learn some of the revolving doors that have been in place. Yet at the same time, it just simply wasn't surprising, because these corporations have invested so much, especially when you're talking about this techno-food and the technology that's in the food and the patents, the R&D that goes into that. They've invested so much. And so, one of the cases that I cite in my research is that, some of the scientists that were preparing the reports to be submitted to the FDA from the corporate side then left that corporation, went into the FDA, and ended up approving their own reports. And again, in our system, there's really nothing wrong with that legally within the system that we've got. However, my point is that, there really should be full disclosure and transparency, so that as consumers and eaters, we can make a choice.
How do you know you're living smart?
You know that you're living smart, I think, when your heart and your head are absolutely aligned in your mission, because there's so much conflict in today's world. And so it's really remembering, to do what your heart and your head are telling you together.
Thank you so much for joining us. And now in our Green Tips, Marcella Murff of the Last Organic Outpost shares her knowledge about community gardening.
Urban gardening is taking land in the city and in the suburban areas and raising gardens in pots, planters, containers, or using vacant lots in the neighborhood to grow a source of nutrient-rich vegetables. Urban farming is sustainable and green-friendly because it does several things. One of those things is to reduce the heat in an area because you're covering up asphalt. You're bringing oxygen from the plants that expire oxygen back into the atmosphere. You're providing local, nutrient-dense vegetables that have been just picked within minutes of eating. And you are bringing, I think, beauty into a neighborhood and using lots and things that might have just had weeds and grass on them. I think starting an urban farm, you just need to look at it, even if you have a couple of whiskey barrels to start with, or maybe on your block there is a lot or a corner of a cul-de-sac that somebody's not using. Get help from the neighbors. Go out there. We do everything volunteer here, and so everybody has a different task, a different duty to do, and we make our own soil, and we do our own irrigation, and I find that if people work at it and put things together as a group, you can grow vegetables, and it's an easy thing to do.
To learn more about green tips or what's in your food supply, go to our website. There you'll find a complete resource list. You can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart. I'm Patricia Gras. Have a safe week.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.